Thank you for joining today's Science-Based Targets Initiative webinar. The purpose of this webinar is to introduce the new Financial Institutions Net Zero Standard Consultation draft and to answer some questions from stakeholders on the consultation draft. This new standard is an example of innovation from the Science-Based Targets Initiative, insofar as we've updated the resources and requirements that we've prepared for financial institutions to set science-based targets. And we've really changed our approach, as you'll see in the presentation today, to broaden and become more interoperable with peer initiatives, and also to introduce a new alignment orientation, which is something that SBTi did not focus on previously. The webinar will have 5 sections. So after a brief introduction, then we will describe how the Science-Based Targets Initiative developed the FINZ standard. Then we'll give a bit more information on the content and structure of the standard. We'll talk about next steps in consultation and the pilot testing that we're doing. And then we'll have a section for questions and answers towards the end of the webinar. I should note that this webinar is being recorded for distribution, and that we welcome all of you who have joined the webinar to submit questions via the question box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Also, this webinar, we're grateful to have simultaneous translation into Spanish, and all of you can access that via the channel box at the bottom of your Zoom screen here. So my name is Nate Aiden, and I'm the head of financial standards at SBTi. And today the presenters will be Owen White, who's the research lead for financial institutions at SBTi, and Jana Mintenig, who is the FINZ manager for SBTi. And they are the 2 primary authors of the FINZ standard. So great to have them here presenting the details of the standard. With that, I will pass it to Owen to explain the development of the FINZ standard consultation draft. Over to you, Owen.
Thank you, Nate. A little bit of background, first of all, then on what has actually been published alongside this draft net zero standard. So a few weeks ago, we did publish the draft of the standard, and this draft contains all of the core requirements and recommendations for financial institutions to establish their long-term net zero targets. This is the culmination of 2 years worth of work that has been undertaken through a foundations paper, into a consultation last year, and now into the final draft of the standard. The main focus of this webinar today will be looking through the details of this draft standard. It's also worth noting that in addition to the draft, we've also published a deeper dive into some metrics and methods. So we have a review paper that's been published that outlines an overview of the various climate metrics that are being used by the financial sector, and also an overview of the various target setting methods that are being applied by the financial sector. And this paper was used then as well to justify and sort of decide upon the various requirements and recommendations in the standard. In addition to that review paper, we also have our consultation survey, which is now live on our website, where anybody can go to actually give feedback on the various aspects. So in terms of the overall development of the standard, many of you might be familiar that SBTi already has an existing guidance for the financial sector that has been launched in 2020 and has been operational for the past 4 years. We now have over 100 financial institutions which have used this guidance, including banks, asset owners, asset managers, and many private equity firms. That has been revised over the past number of years to update it in terms of adding clarifications, and most recently, earlier this year, to expand coverage to introduce broader approaches to fossil fuels. So in parallel to this near-term guidance, we have also then been developing our net zero standard. And really the goal of the net zero standard is to have a much more comprehensive update to our thinking behind the financial sector and the types of targets they should be setting. And as Nate mentioned, one of the key goals here is interoperability with other standards and methodologies that are being used in the financial sector. So this started with our foundations paper, which was launched in 2022, which established a lot of the core principles and aspects that we think should be captured. We then had a consultation last year on some of the preliminary criteria, and now the consultation draft here, which is the fully fledged standard. So the ultimate vision here is once the FINZ standard is actually launched, there will be a time, of course, when financial institutions can continue to set targets with our near-term guidance, but they will also have the opportunity to add those long-term targets with our net zero standard, with the end goal of having one universal standard for near-term targets and long-term targets that can be used by various financial institutions. I wanted to just quickly look at the conceptual framework that we're using to build the standard, and that will also help explain a little bit more of the requirements that we go through shortly. So really the standard is outlining the near-term action that is required to achieve that long-term net zero end state. We have two main paths that we have defined to net zero. The first path here is this green line, which is our portfolio alignment. So this is very much an alignment path which tracks the share of financial flows that are actually aligned to 1.5-degree goals over time. And in addition to this path, we have our absolute emissions, so financed emissions, portfolio emissions, that need to decline towards net zero. So rather than a strict focus on actually reducing portfolio emissions, the standard is actually focused on increasing portfolio alignment as our leading metric. So we want to increase the share of financial flows that are going towards companies in the real economy that are transitioning or that have already transitioned to that net zero end state. And as a result of this increasing alignment, the lagging indicator of portfolio emissions then is expected to decline towards that net zero end state. In addition to this conceptual framework, the standard also outlines some of the best practices and the requirements that we need to see at different timeframes in the transition. So we have an immediate, a medium term, and a long-term timeframe that has been established. The immediate timeframe looks at what are those entry requirements that we want to see from financial institutions that they need to do now. So this is primarily around not undermining the transition and essentially phasing out some financing of incompatible climate activities, such as certain types of new fossil fuel infrastructure and certain types of deforestation. The medium timeframe then is where we expect financial institutions to establish these portfolio alignment type targets, so to increase the share of their financing that is going towards companies that have transitioned or are transitioning towards net zero. And the long term then is ensuring that all portfolio companies actually reach that net zero end state, with any residual emissions in the portfolio being balanced by permanent carbon removals. So these are the three steps that we outline that we'll have a little bit more detail on as we go through the various requirements today. The last point to note here in terms of the development process is the overall structure of the standard. This is slightly changing compared to where SBTi has normally developed standards, and we have looking here as primarily focusing on how do we increase the measurability when it comes to Scope 3 emissions. SBTi also recently published a broader discussion paper on Scope 3, where we outline some of the challenges that we're seeing around how do companies and financial institutions actually address their Scope 3 emissions. And all financed emissions and facilitated emissions and insurance-associated emissions are ultimately Scope 3 emissions. So the goal here is actually for the standard to define specific actions that can lead to more measurable outcomes that ultimately then in the long term can drive that long-term impact. So an example of some of these actions that we've outlined in the standard are like good climate governance, the quantification of climate impacts through greenhouse gas accounting, establishing of key climate-aligned policies, and then setting, of course, those traditional alignment and emission-based targets. So you'll see a little bit later on how we actually establish these actions, but the goal here is ultimately to combine both these outcome metrics and those impact metrics to have a much more measurable standard that we can actually then better track the progress of the financial sector over time. So with that, I'll hand you over to my colleague to go into a little bit more detail on some of those core requirements.
Thank you very much, Owen. I'll go and walk you through the standard and the steps that an FI would have to take in order to set a target with the standard. And before jumping into those detailed steps, I'll start with an overview. As Owen already described it, the standard is going beyond decarbonization targets and extending the set of also alignment targets. So to make that a little more tangible, here's an illustrative dashboard of how the end product could look like for, in this case, an illustrative commercial bank setting a target with the FINZ standard. FINZ, just shortly, that is the abbreviation we use for the Financial Institutions Net Zero standard. As you can see, the dashboard is composed of 5 key building blocks. The top left identifying who's setting the target, then the portfolio boundary, meaning who identifying for which activities the bank is setting a target and focusing the action on. The third is the segmentation exercise. Because portfolio boundary, we'll see that in a second, is more holistic. The segmentation exercise highlights where to take action first. So it's a prioritization of action. The fourth building block in the bottom left corner is disclosure metrics. With the FINZ standard, we increase transparency around key activities, starting from GHG emissions and including fossil fuel exposure and fossil fuel to renewable energy ratio. And then the last and biggest block on the right side of the slide is then the action metrics. And as Ona has already mentioned it, it's 3 key action metrics that we are asking FIs to take action on. The first is the immediate action items with policies, then the new element, the climate alignment target, and third, the emission intensive targets, so focusing on the key priority areas and setting targets here. That's just outlining the key steps. I will now start and walk you through each of those steps. And the next slide just highlights that it's 5 steps essentially, and those 5 steps will guide us going through the next slides. I'll pause here to also say that the standard has as a 6th element a reporting chapter, to highlight that there is also an increase in transparency that we ask for going forward. It's not part of a validation process, so that's why it's not part of this presentation, just here to highlight that it is part of the FINZ standard. So I will now walk you through the steps 1 to 5, and you can see those 5 steps also on the bottom of the slide. So I'll start with the first step, which is establishing the organizational boundary. So identifying who's setting the target, establishing the net zero commitment, and understanding which SBTi standard needs to be used. To highlight here is that FINZ is focusing on scope 3 category 15 only, with a revenue trigger of 5% or higher, to use that to set targets for any portfolio activities as part of scope 3 category 15. For the operational emissions, scope 1 and 2, as well as for the value chain emissions, we will be referring to the corporate net zero standard for FIs. This seeks to have a consistent approach across SBTi for entities to walk through the process, and also is more in line with responsibilities within the organization. Once the organizational boundary is established and it's identified that targets have to be set for scope 3 category 15, the next item is to identify the portfolio boundary. So which activities within the portfolio are actually in scope of setting the target. And as you can see here on the slide, it's 5. The FINZ standard defines 5 financial activities: lending, asset owner investing, asset manager investing, capital market activities, and insurance underwriting. And each of them are considered to be in scope whenever they compose more than 5% of the financial activities revenue. So again, a simplified approach based on an exhaustive list of activities that are considered to be in scope or out of scope for target setting. And also, as you can see through the red flag on the bottom, there's an extended scope in the financial standard now, capturing also capital market activities and insurance underwriting. Those 2 activities have not been part of SBTi works before, so it's a new addition, enabling also a wider set of targets for FIs, increasing the scope here. From portfolio boundary, the next step is then the segmentation exercise. And this segmentation exercise is important because the portfolio boundary is more holistic and therefore more simplified. But then we are not suggesting that targets have to be set and actions have to be taken on everything immediately, but rather that there is a targeted approach focusing on most relevant activities first and not chasing any long tail activities already in year 0. To make that work, we introduce the segmentation. And as you can see on the slide, there's 2 cases how we do the segmentation exercise. And I'll start with case 1, which is relevant for lending and insurance underwriting. As you can see, the segmentation exercise for that case 1 is a 2x2 matrix, so identifying 4 groups with different priority areas. And the split is done by 1, the vertical axis, climate impact. Higher climate impact is defined through belonging to certain sectors, such as energy, transportation, industry, and buildings, so all high-emitting sectors. And lower climate impact is essentially then all other sectors not covered in the higher climate impact. And then the second category, the horizontal axis, is influence, which we group in reasonable and limited influence, where reasonable influence are any large companies, non-SME companies, and limited influence is the SME companies in the portfolio, as well as consumer loans in high impact areas, such as residential mortgage or motor vehicle loans, or also personal lines insurance in those 2 sectors. As you can see through the red box, action should be prioritized on segments 1 and 2 first. So here's really the high priority area where FIs have high influence and also there's a high climate impact. Then the second case is rather relevant for investing activities. You can see we reduced the scope for influence. So the limited influence category is no longer available here. And instead, we break down the high impact category number 1 into 2 boxes. And why is that important? We differentiate between the entity that needs to be addressed with the target. One category is that we ask to the target and the engagement to happen on the underlying real economy companies. So to the companies in the sectors, energy, transport, etc. And the second component is that we ask the action and the target to be set on the value chain. So for the asset owner to set a target to have third-party asset managers start their transition and have a target themselves. And this differentiation, so on whom to target for is differentiated based on 3 elements. First, the role, so whether it's asset owner or asset manager, then the type of mandate, and lastly, the strategy, so active or passive. You can remember the purple boxes for both cases here, because these will be what we will refer to in the next slides going forward as the key priority areas. As I've mentioned on the first slide on the dashboard, we seek to increase transparency through 3 key elements where we ask an annual transparent reporting on those activities. The first is GHG disclosure, so making the portfolio emissions transparent and reporting on quality and data improvements over time. Here it's crucial to say that the minimum requirement is to focus again on the high impact areas, but then to increase the emission accounting until 2030, the latest, to have a full inventory at that point, and then increase scope and quality over time. So it's highlighting the journey element of the emission accounting as well. Then the 2 other items relate to fossil fuels, where we ask for transparency around fossil fuel exposure to the full value chain, and then to put that number into perspective, also asking for a fossil fuel to renewable ratio in terms of financing activities. That's the step number 4, and I'll now jump to step number 5, which we will have more slides on. So because it's the most important one, the largest group, there's more content on our action items. So the first action item, the immediate action item, is the policies, where there's 2 minimum requirements that FIs would have to have prior to setting or starting the validation process. So already in year 0, have policies in place that prevent any future harmful activities in the areas of deforestation and fossil fuel financing. So those policies are essential to avoid any future harmful activities. Further, we do have some, we add policy recommendations for other long-lived high-emitting assets, as well as lower influence activities in case those represent a high share of the FI's portfolio. I will walk now to the next action item, which is the targets. And we do have two types of targets that are both relevant for the near and long-term dimension. And the two types of targets are the climate alignment financing target and the sector emission intensive targets, as you can see here on the right. I'll start with the left side then, the portfolio climate alignment target. And as you can see, it's one overarching target, which has some relevant conditions that need to be fulfilled. So for the 2030 milestone, the condition that 95% of high climate impact, so the purple box you've seen before, are already transitioning. And by 2040, that 95% of all large entities, so all reasonable influence, are transitioning with a linear increase over time. And then eventually by 2050, have all entities achieve net zero. So there's essentially two types of transitions happening. First, to increase the share of companies within the FI's portfolio to start their transition, and then to move those entities from transitioning, so from showing a transition ambition towards progress, to eventually having them achieve net zero. That's part of the climate alignment journey. And we'll talk about the definitions, etc., in a bit on the next slides. So that's the left side. The right side is then the sector emission intensive targets, where for all critical sectors, we're asking the FI to set targets to reach certain sector benchmarks. So have intensity targets for those crucial sectors by 2030 and 2050. And then there's for 2040 a separate ask for the limited influence categories on homeowners, so residential mortgage and homeowner insurance, as well as motor vehicles. So those are the two types of targets. And I'll pass it back to Owen to walk you through more details on what's behind the left side, so the climate alignment targets.
Thank you, Jana. So our climate alignment target is a sort of a new form of target that we're introducing as part of the FINZ standard. And for those of you who are familiar with our near-term guidance, we do already have two types of alignment targets that FIs are currently using. Those are our portfolio coverage method and our temperature rating method. And both of those methods essentially look at the targets that portfolio companies are setting, either approved SBTi targets or other ambitious targets that they have publicly disclosed. And we looked at those two methods as part of this development process to understand, are they both suitable for near-term and long-term targets? And then we took the decision that we wanted to update and consolidate those two methods into a more unified climate alignment method that actually applied both for near-term and for that long-term net zero end state. So rather than a focus purely on increasing the share of the portfolio that is covered by valid and ambitious targets, we want to increase the share of the overall portfolio that is going towards companies that have targets. We're also able to demonstrate progress against those targets, and indeed also to capture the broader range of climate solutions and other types of entities and activities that may already be operating at zero emissions. So it's a broader approach to alignment that captures different types of activities that are happening in the real economy. In terms of then how this method actually works in practice, there's two main steps that we use. The first step is defining actually, well, what should count as climate alignment and what should count at different points in time. And the second step then is defining that level of ambition. What are those key milestones in terms of how aligned the portfolio has to be at different points in time, both in the near term and in the long term. In terms then of that first step of defining what counts as climate alignment, we have split this into two key buckets. The first is this transitioning bucket, which looks essentially at, are the portfolio companies actually transitioning? Either do they have ambitious targets? Are they demonstrating progress? and are they able to contribute to the overall global climate goals? The second major bucket then is this net zero achieved bucket. And this looks at any companies or indeed projects or other activities that are already operating at zero emissions. There may not be, unfortunately, many of those operating today, but the intention is that they will hopefully increase over time, and they should be captured and ultimately incentivized as part of this framework. A big question then in this first step as well is how to actually assess all these different frameworks for transitioning. And this gets back to this key point we mentioned earlier on interoperability. So obviously companies setting targets, either SBTs or others, are a key priority that we want. But we also recognize that there's many other types of companies and other types of activities which may not actually be captured under traditional emission reduction targets. There's many other types of third-party frameworks, such as climate taxonomies that are being used to assess climate solutions. There's other types of use of proceeds instruments like green bonds that are also being widely used in the financial sector to help financial institutions actually finance the transition. These are traditionally not well captured under some of our existing approaches, and we want to better explore actually during this process, during our pilot testing, which we're now commencing, how to integrate these other types of frameworks into the standard so that we ensure both that we have the right incentives and that it's clearly interoperable with other types of methodologies, other types of regulations that the financial sector now has to follow. So as we move into the second step then on looking at that level of ambition, this very much mirrors some of our traditional approaches to portfolio coverage, where we want to increase that share of the portfolio that is climate aligned over time. If we start with that end state, then we're looking for at least 95% of the portfolio to be net zero achieved by 2050 or earlier. And at this point, that means that those entities have actually achieved that net zero end state, and any residual emissions would have to be permanently neutralized through the financing of negative emissions companies or technologies. To get to that point, then the goal is that by 2040, we need at least 95% to be at least transitioning. So they have to be demonstrating progress against a 1.5 aligned target at that point to be able to actually count towards climate alignment. We may already see that a certain part of that portfolio is already net zero achieved at that point, but what we're actually looking at is that at least 95% are demonstrating that transition. And then, as is today, we want to see that linear growth from the current base year all the way to 2040. What's slightly different about this approach as well is that we have a special focus on 2030 and 2035 as those key interim milestones, and about how do we prioritize alignment over the near term. And this comes back a little bit what Jana introduced earlier in terms of that segmentation exercise. So we want to ensure that financial institutions focus on those most high climate impact and high areas of influence. They should be aligned first. So obviously those climate relevant sectors, it is more important that those sectors are aligned first. So rather than financial institutions having to chase a longer tail of lower climate impact companies such as SMEs, the focus upfront in those earlier years is those higher climate relevant companies. What the framework shows ultimately is that in the long term, essentially all the portfolio will have to be addressed, but we want to make sure that we have a materiality focus up front to focus on those most climate relevant companies. And I want to conclude this section then with just a quick summary of some of the major differences between our existing guidance and this standard. And as we kind of highlighted throughout, there is some major changes that we're introducing here. So wanted to kind of summarize where those changes actually occurred and some of the benefits of those. So the first major change is around the scope of the standard. As of today, we only focus on investing and lending activities. The FINZ standard now introduces capital markets and insurance underwriting for the first time. So the financial institutions will be expected to both assess the climate impact of those, and in the case of insurance underwriting, to also establish their first SBTs. The second major element then is on the concept of coverage. We have provided a more holistic approach to coverage, and ideally try to simplify this into in-scope versus out-of-scope activities. As of today, we have a very detailed, nuanced approach to coverage that is defined within each asset class. The intention of the FINZ standard is to have more simple in-scope and out-of-scope. And when it comes to in-scope, the coverage is simply 100%. Now, in order to operationalize that, the third element on prioritization becomes very important. Given a 100% boundary, the focus then is how do we actually prioritize what should be addressed first within that 100%. And that's where this prioritization exercise comes in, and we're introducing this concept of this climate relevance so that financial institutions can focus on the most climate relevant aspects of their portfolio first and chase those longer tails of climate impact a little bit later in the alignment process. The fourth major element then is on our alignment metrics and methods. As I mentioned, we're consolidating the concept of alignment into one unified method, which is very much a kind of a transition finance type target. It is looking to proactively go and finance the transition, and it seeks to incorporate then a broader range of frameworks and methodologies that can be used to assess the alignment of different types of companies and projects that the financial institution might be financing. And again, the main goal of that fourth element is this to increase this interoperability. The final element then, of course, is on this concept of time frame, where this standard will allow a clear journey towards net zero, and actually can establish both these near-term targets for 2030, 2035, but then also allow financial institutions to define what they actually have to achieve in the long term, 2040, and out towards that net zero end year. So it provides a holistic approach, both for near-term and long-term targets, and a clear journey then, with clear expectations of what the financial institution has to do at each point in time before they reach that net zero end state. So I will hand you back now to Nate to just to finalize some of the next steps.
Wonderful. Thank you, Owen. And lots of great information from both Owen and Jana here. Lots for people to digest here, but and great to see all of the excellent questions from all of the participants. So thank you for those. Before we get to answering some of those questions, just a little bit of information about next steps. So as most of you should know already, SBTi is in the process of transitioning from its roots 9 years ago as a startup across a few different NGOs to a more formal standard setting organization. And as part of that, we incorporated last year and we introduced a standard operating procedure. And so the FINZ standard that we're discussing today is following that standard operating procedure. As part of that is this consultation. And you can see we've broken this current phase into 3 different streams. So the first is the public consultation, which we're talking about here today. And we're inviting all of you to participate by filling out our feedback survey. The second level here is pilot testing, where we're very happy to have almost 40 financial institutions participating in the pilot testing, whereby they go through the details and actually apply this to their own investment, lending, underwriting, and capital markets activities and portfolios. And then also we're looking at feedback in terms of methods and metrics as we pivot from the 3 methods that we used with our 2020 framework. So this broader approach that Owen and Jana have described here, we're exploring how SBTi maintains consistency across a broader range of methods and metrics here. In terms of where we're going, this consultation phase, as you can see on the slide, will be open through next month. And then we will summarize all of the feedback that we receive from all of you and financial institutions and other stakeholders into public synthesis document, which we will share with all of you once that's ready. And that'll be a next step. And then looking down the track, we will revise the FINZ standard to address the feedback that we're receiving. The methods and metrics piece that Owen described will be incorporated as an annex to the FINZ standard. And we will then go back to our technical council to review these revisions. And once we've gained approval from them, then we will go to the SBTi board for final approval for publication and implementation of this FINZ standard for financial institutions. In terms of the feedback. There's, as I said, a lot of information here, as you've seen, but we've summarized it here into 5 points, which correspond with the 5 chapters of the FINZ standard draft. And so the first, as Jana described here, is this entity level commitment and leadership. And so this is new in the sense that SBTi hasn't had this type of policy requirement previously. And so we're certainly keen to hear from all of you in terms of how that works, and whether you think it's how it relates to other existing initiatives. The segmentation aspect that Jana explained is new for us, and it's some feedback we received from the earlier 2020 framework, where there is intended to be more of a focus on materiality. So those areas for the financial institutions that have the highest emissions and highest influence, but also a new approach with our standard setting approach of continuous improvement. So this is integrated into the milestones and this idea of iterating as we go to improve over time as additional data become available. And this links to the second section here, which is GHG accounting. And so we continue to have this exposure and portfolio emissions aspect to the work, but that's seen as a bit of a lagging indicator, whereas some of the alignment and forward sector targets are more of a leading indicator. Neutralization is another related topic here that we're consulting on. And so we look forward to your feedback on that. The third area here is around the alignment targets that Owen was just describing. And this obviously is oriented around that milestone approach and looking at different publicly available taxonomies and resources for categorizing aligned or aligning financial activities. And then finally, the last 2 sections are around emissions intensive sector targets. And so these are really building on what we call an SBTi, the sector decarbonization approach, generally intensity approaches, though again, we're broadening here to look at different publicly available metrics and approaches. And then finally, of course, reporting, where that's always been a key component of SBTi, that we require entities that set targets with us to publicly report on their emissions inventory or performance so that they can be tracked against this target that they've set. And so we've elaborated some of those reporting requirements with the FINZ draft. As we've said, we really are keen to get all of your feedback. And so the QR code that's on this slide will take you to the survey. There's also links to the survey in our materials that we will share with all of you after this webinar. And if you have questions about the survey or this consultation process, there is a dedicated email address that you can see here, and we'll again share it with all of you so you don't have to copy it down, that will answer your questions regarding this consultation and the FINZ draft. With that, we will now turn to all of your questions. So thank you for listening so far. And we've received many excellent questions. And so we will go through the ones that we can cover here, and we will follow up for any that are not covered here publicly. So bear with us, and thank you. Please continue to submit your questions. They're much appreciated. And really that's what this is all about, is us having a conversation with all of you. So the first question relates to the existing work of SBTi in terms of the framework that was published in 2020 and how FINZ and this draft that we've described today relates for those financial institutions that have validated science-based targets now. So there are, at this point, 125 financial institutions that have validated science-based targets. And the first point here is that those validated science-based targets will stand for 5 years, as is the policy across SBTi. So across the initiative, we constantly iterate and innovate with our work, and we also update with new climate science with the IPCC's 6th assessment report, and we're anticipating the 7th assessment report. But of course, we have to also respect the targets that are set over time. And so the way that we address this is through transparency, where it's very clear on our website when a target was validated against which set of criteria. and that will continue. So that's just clear for those 125 financial institutions with validated science-based targets. In terms of the those that are committed now, publicly committed, or considering committing, generally the SBTi policy is to allow 24 months for the entity, whether it's a financial institution or real economy company, to follow through on its public commitment to submit the target after it's made a public commitment. In this case, those financial institutions that have made a public net zero commitment, perhaps through the BA 1.5 campaign or otherwise, will have 24 months after the publication of this FINZ standard for implementation. At this point, pending those institutional processes that I mentioned with our technical council and board, we're aiming to have this published at the beginning of next year. And so that will start the clock. And there is also a separate 6-month deadline for those FIs that are already in process, but then make a switch and say, oh, they want to consider the FINZ standard, so that it gives them some time to consider. That also, so that's sort of the FINZ track. Now, as we mentioned in the written response here, there will be a period of choice here where financial institutions may choose between the existing financial institutions' near-term V2 criteria and the new FINZ requirements. And so there will be this period that we anticipate to be a year at this point when financial institutions may choose. Eventually, to simplify and consolidate, we do expect everything to go into the net zero standard, but we're doing this in a very intentional, regimented way, partially to get feedback from the financial institutions and other stakeholders on the differences between the FinFET2 approach, which we've had now for 4 years, and this very new FINZ approach, which we're very excited about, but we want to understand what aspects of it are more straightforward or more novel or challenging for financial institutions and other stakeholders. So thank you for that first set of questions. For the next question, the question is, folks mentioned, it's great to see the focus on interoperability in the standard. Will the SBTi develop a list of approved third-party standards or methodologies that can be used? And for this, I will direct it to Owen.
Thanks, Nate. Yeah, excellent question. The intention is that during our pilot phase, so we currently do not have a list in the standard for approved third-party frameworks. The intention is during the pilot testing phase, we will actually be assessing a lot of these frameworks that exist. So, for example, different taxonomies. We have different third-party frameworks, such as types of implied temperature rise metrics, other types of company benchmarks. So we are actually assessing a broader range of those now during the pilot testing. And the intention then, yes, is there will be a much clearer approach then for institutions in the final standard. So there'll be a clear idea of which of the metrics they can use, which of the frameworks that they'll be able to use. And a couple of the other questions that had come up through the chat as well is, the relationship between our the transition finance framework, climate alignment framework, and other types of frameworks such as the GFANZ transition finance, where they have 4 different types of transition finance types. The IIGCC framework, for example, is another very complementary approach that exists now on assessing the alignment of different types of companies. So we're looking at those very closely as well to make sure that our approach is very much compatible with theirs. We don't need new terminology. We don't need additional frameworks. So we're very much trying to actually rely on existing approaches. So we have some kind of minimum credibility criteria that we have established, and we're going to be testing now during the pilot phase. And that will allow us then to have a much clearer idea of what are those eligible inputs that can be used when it comes to defining climate alignment. Nate.
Wonderful. Thanks, Owen. And you mentioned transition plans there, and that's obviously a focus area for a lot of financial institutions and a subject of some of the questions here. So perhaps for you, Jana, maybe just simplifying some of these questions, what is the role of transition plans in FINZ?
Thank you, Nate. That's also indeed a great question. So maybe let me start with the first message that we do see targets and transition plans as complementary, with the transition plan being essentially the translation of the target into measures and actions on how to reach the target, essentially. And also we want to acknowledge that there's great work happening already outside. So a lot of developments, both for the real economy as well as for financial entities. But still, it is a fairly new area for financial institutions. And as part of FINZ, there's actually two levels. The first level is for the FI themselves to have a transition plan. And it's currently a recommendation in the standard that FIs develop a transition plan on how to reach the net zero target. And it's a core area where we also appreciate any feedback around the ambition level of setting that transition plan, whether it should be a requirement, yes or no. So comments and feedback here are really appreciated. And the second level relevant for FIs as well is assessing the underlying counterparties through their transition plans. Also fairly new area, so we will continue working on that element. And you can see it in table 15 of the standard, that it's part of the suggested approach on how to assess progress of counterparties starting 2030. So those are the two levels. Thank you, Nate. Back to you.
Thanks, Jana. So I think, it's what you're seeing here is consistency in terms of interoperability and trying to have a sort of both and approach rather than either or. So the next question, well, first, it looks like, Owen, you may have frozen. Can you hear us?
I can still hear you fine.
Excellent. Okay, we can hear you as well. So let's go to the next question, which is, are near-term absolute emission reductions required or recommended?
Yeah, another great question. So as of now, they are not required to set near-term absolute reduction targets. And if the audience members here remembers one of those initial slides that we presented in our two pathways to net zero, we had a portfolio alignment pathway, which is kind of a leading metric, and then we had kind of a lagging metric then of absolute portfolio emissions.
Jana?
Yes, happy to. So as Owen was starting, you see we've shown those two graphs. So the leading climate alignment and the lagging indicator of portfolio emissions, with for FIs having a credible net zero claim in 2050. Obviously, they need to reduce absolute emissions, but we acknowledge with the alignment that FIs have a crucial role to play on helping companies transition. So in the near term, we're not the theory of change behind the standard is not requiring an absolute emission reduction target in the near term, to acknowledge for the fact that they have a role to play in helping counterparties transition in high emitting sectors, so cement and steel companies, etc. So no emission reduction target then until 2030 for near term.
Great. Thanks, Jana. That's very clear. And related to this question around absolute emissions, there's another one. Will FIs have to use PCAF? The PCAF standard, for folks who aren't familiar, is the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, to calculate their emissions.
Yes, I'll follow up on that one. Thank you, Nate. So we acknowledge the PCAF's approach for emission accounting and recommend using it for first calculating the GHG emissions, as it is the most extensive standard out there currently for assessing emissions. And it links it links well to what I've described before. So for setting or for claiming net zero in 2050, a clear GHG accounting is necessary and required.
Great, thank you, Jana. I can see we have some questions about detail coverage and where SBTi is going here. And so one of the questions notes that there's a higher level of detail around investment and lending activities than around these new areas for SBTi of insurance underwriting and capital markets activities. And so I can answer this one, give Owen and Jana a break here for a second. So generally, these are new for SBTi, and so we don't have that precedent that we have for the other areas. And so we are clearly including them here in the scope of the FINZ standard. But we also broadly are planning to have a bit of a sort of broad introductory standard that is this FINZ standard draft that we've presented here today. But then we plan to elaborate that for particular types of financial institution once the FINZ standard is published. And so the idea is that we will have a follow-on, more deep dive focused standard on insurance underwriting to really cover the details there in more depth and detail than is possible in this FINZ standard. And so that's something to anticipate here, and just to understand the structure of our work. We can't do everything all at once, especially because we don't want to burden everyone with a 1,000-page standard that covers everything. So the idea here is we introduce the approaches and broad framework for financial institutions that we've covered here today, and then we elaborate and iterate once we publish this. So that's just a little bit of context. Welcome back, Owen. Hope the connection holds here. It looks good. So another question for you is, what is the role of climate or green taxonomies in the FINZ standard, and how will we be covering, for example, climate solutions?
Thanks, Nate. Yeah, great question. And I think, quite similar to some of the previous questions then, in terms of how do we look at other types of frameworks and methodologies that are currently being used by the financial sector. So when it comes to taxonomies and climate solutions more broadly, when we look, for example, at how some of our existing approaches work, we're primarily focused on entities, so portfolio companies, and them setting targets, demonstrating their alignment to 1.5 degree goals. When it looks at sort of climate solutions and taxonomies, we're primarily looking at the activity level. And we kind of felt that a lot of our current approaches don't really address exactly, is a specific economic activity green? Is it operating, for example, at a very low emissions value that might not traditionally be captured? And we know, for example, that a lot of the climate solutions that exist today may not be covered by traditional SBTs. And we still need a mechanism to incentivize their financing, which would not currently be addressed. So that's kind of how we see the role of taxonomies. We know, of course, taxonomies as well. Some of them can be controversial. They're political in nature in many respects. So it's also ensuring that we have credible approaches and credible taxonomies that can be used. The SBTi is not going to create our own taxonomy. It will be very much looking at third-party taxonomies that are being used in different jurisdictions. So that's kind of one area that we see as an easy approach for us to be able to broaden the types of coverage and the activity level that we can capture. And this is sort of one way to then more closely integrate climate solutions. For example, many of the other net zero alliances and other types of approaches out there are encouraging, of course, the financing of the necessary climate solutions. So with this goal of interoperability, we want to make sure as well that the financial institution standard doesn't disincentivize the financing of climate solutions, and hence we need to be able to recognize them. And that's where we see the primary role of taxonomies. There may, of course, be other types of frameworks that are developed in the future. And, as Nate just mentioned, part of the goal of this standard as well is to create that existing framework, and that can be easily updated over time. So as new methodologies are developed, as new taxonomies, new frameworks are produced, we can incorporate them much more easily over time. That is often not the case with how some of our existing guidance is structured, but the goal of the SBTi going forward, also some of our corporate scope 3 work, is to make this much more easy to integrate different types of third-party frameworks and benchmarks over time.
Excellent answer, Owen. So a lot of information there. I think that coordination with the corporate net zero update is a key point for folks, and that the new thinking that you're seeing here in the FINZ standard is also being reflected in the update for the corporate net zero standard and our broader scope 3 work. And so we look forward to feedback from all of you on these new approaches through the survey or other channels that you want to use to talk to us. Another question we have here, and obviously a big area for financial institutions and global climate broadly, is fossil fuels, of course. And so this one is, what is the relationship between the policies and targets that are required in FINZ for financial institutions coming to their fossil fuel activities and investments, et cetera? And Jana, could you take that one?
Yes, happy to. Thank you, Nate. And it's an important question. So I'll start with the role of policies. As we've described throughout, policies are the immediate action items, and the role of the policies within the FINZ standard is to prevent any harmful future activities. So that's how also fossil fuels comes into play here. So policies address that there should be no future new financial activities in fossil fuel in the fossil fuel value chain. So to prevent any harmful activities in that area. And that's why this policy also captures all financial activities that we've mentioned, including capital market activities. So no, to also avoid harmful activities in that field. The targets themselves on fossil fuels, they especially address the existing fossil fuel portfolio within an FI's portfolio and asset classes. Back to you, Nate.
Great. Thank you, Jana. And I think this is a key area. And I think, we also at SBTi are developing the oil and gas standard for oil and gas companies to set targets with us, science-based targets. And so that will be another key development that we're coordinating with across SBTi. So it's not just FINZ alone, it's linked with the corporate net zero update as well as the sector updates that we're doing, namely around oil and gas there. Great. So one of the new things with FINZ is this milestone approach and continuous improvement idea. So the question is, how this relates to near and long-term targets and how that is done across SBTi for both financial institutions and companies. So perhaps for this one, how about over to you, Owen?
Thanks, Nate. Yeah, great question. And it does actually, address some of the updates to the broader SBTi architecture of standards and how do we actually look beyond simply targets to make sure that we have more measurable progress. So the idea of the milestones here is we want to ensure that companies and financial institutions have clear expectations of what is required at different points in time as they go towards that journey to net zero. So not only in terms of target ambition, but also, for example, in terms of the quality and the scope of their emissions reporting. So as we sort of highlighted earlier, we don't have near-term absolute reduction targets, but we have clear milestones for the quality and the scope of how financial institutions should be reporting their greenhouse gas emissions or their financed emissions or their insurance associated emissions, for example. So those kind of milestones fit in across both the targets, but also the broader sets of requirements as well, such as emissions reporting. And what we have done is we've established milestones that are in 5-year intervals from now all the way to 2050. And then institutions can essentially understand what are those expectations. And this is sort of the unified approach then that will allow the standard to be relevant for near-term targets and long-term targets. It also then enables for certain financial institutions who want to set net zero targets before 2050. So for example, 2040, 2045, they can also do so then under this approach because they have clear understanding of what is that expectation. So it provides, I think, more transparency on the journey, that they know what are they signing up to at this point and what will be the expectations then at different points in time.
Excellent, Owen, thank you for that. And I think the journey is a key theme here. It's a journey for financial institutions and SBTi. We're out of time, unfortunately. Thank you. We could receive more than 60 questions. We really appreciate everyone's attention and engagement. Please fill out the survey and continue to work with us on this. And appreciate everyone's time. Look forward to following up with all of you. Take care.